On the day of his death at the hands of four former Minneapolis police officers, a grocery store worker accused George Floyd of using a counterfeit $20 bill. Some, particularly in the Muslim American community, are questioning why the store called the police in the first place. The answer may lie in so-called nuisance abatement laws, which can put pressure on small businesses to report even low-level crimes, like the one Floyd was accused of committing. Moustafa Bayoumi wrote that column in the New York Times. He is an English professor at Brooklyn College and the author of the 2008 book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America. Professor Bayoumi, thank you so much for joining us. Can you please first explain for us what exactly are nuisance abatement laws?
Sure. Hi, Tanya. It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me. Nuisance abatement laws are basically civil statutes that municipalities use to deal with properties or people that are considered to be nuisances. And a nuisance could be anything from a corner store dealing drugs to having a messy lawn, for example. There are residential nuisance abatement laws and there are commercial nuisance abatement laws. And in my article, I focused on the commercial nuisance abatement laws, which have a history, especially here in New York City, of being directed at small immigrant-owned businesses in low-income neighborhoods.
And you write that these laws often act as third-party policing. So explain how they can hurt both the immigrant shop owners and the communities, often of color, that they exist in, and what's being done to address that.
Absolutely. So it would often work like this. In New York, the way it worked was this way. The police would be setting up small businesses in low-income neighborhoods through the use of undercover officers or confidential informants to have some kind of illegal activity happening there. The illegal activity that was being set up wouldn't even have to be done by the store owner. It could just be happening in the store, for example. Then the courts would hit the business with nuisance abatement infractions, and the fastest way for the shops to reopen would be for the store owners to accept things like the surveillance of the customers by cameras for the police, the department itself. And as you say, using civilians to do the police's work also has a name in the criminology literature, and it's called third-party policing.
And this has been addressed before. Like you said, in New York, there were some laws put into place to sort of take the pressure off of these, largely immigrant-owned businesses. What else is being done? Is this being focused on nationally now?
I mean, the nuisance abatement laws are all at the municipal level. So if you actually look across the country, you can see that their use is widespread. And not only is the use widespread, the cost to immigrant store owners is also substantial. And one of the reasons why that's the case is because immigrant store owners are often, they don't have a lot of wealth, they don't have a lot of capital. They're working hand to mouth in a lot of these places, and then they're being forced by the police to also operate in these ways. And this, as I say, is happening across the country. And what it does is it produces a lot of potential conflict between customers and owners, or between, in other words, different vulnerable communities of color.
Absolutely. And, your piece also delves into the partially more sensitive topic of anti-Black racism among some non-Black Muslim Americans. Why is that a prevalent problem in that community? Because as you point out in your piece, a large percentage of Black Americans are actually Muslim.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I think racism is a problem, for so many people in this country, not just non-Black Muslims, but it does have a special problem for non-Black Muslims. So as non-Black Muslims, as you say, should recognize that about a third of the American Muslim community is African American. And not only that, it's like the deep history of Islam in the United States is intimately connected with the Black freedom struggle. From the very beginnings, from the very foundations of this country, we've seen American Muslims, very often African American, who were part of the American family. So yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem within the larger American Muslim community, and it's one that I think it's time that the American Muslim community look at squarely and try to address.
Frankly, to be honest, I'm Latina. Racism among different ethnic groups is not just an isolated issue. Sadly, it exists among almost all ethnic groups, if you understand my meaning. Like, in other words, it's not just a problem of non-Black Muslims. There's racism among Latino communities. There's racism among, Asian communities. It's interesting that it often becomes framed as a white-Black issue, but it isn't solely a white-Black issue.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, back in the 90s, Toni Morrison wrote this really important essay for Time magazine about how one of the first things that new immigrants subscribe to when they come to the United States as a form of assimilation is to adopt a lot of anti-Black racism. So I think there's something that's embedded into a kind of American assimilationist logic that almost requires people to adopt that. And that's precisely the kind of logic that we have to change.
Absolutely. And so what are some of the larger fixes that you would like to see happen, not just with these sort of community policing laws and not just with these cultural issues? How do we, let me reframe that question. How do we address both of those things together?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, really, to ask. And I don't have an easy solution for all of that. I mean, I do think that it's necessary that we start engaging in really hard dialogues, and we look at each of our communities. To that end, I can say that the Muslim American community, I think, is making some progress. You have groups like, say, Muslim ARC, which is the Muslim Anti-Racist Collective that's doing fantastic work across the country. You have a lot of national meetings being held over Zoom to address this issue right now because of the George Floyd killing. So I think that there's a lot of progress being had there. But, I also think that it's really important that we understand that this is about making sure that this country is not just safe for everybody, but that it is equal in terms of freedom and opportunity for everyone as well.
Right. I think you're right in pointing out that it is equal in freedom and opportunity, because I think where these constricting feelings of racism occur, it's often because there is a sense that there isn't enough for everybody to go around. And that's something that shouldn't be true in our country.
I think that's 100% true. And I think we have to understand the ways in which even the economic structure of the country has not just limits opportunity for some people, but in fact pits us against each other.
Absolutely. Well, Moustafa Bayoumi, thank you so much for joining us. I could talk to you about this all day, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you so much. We appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Tanya. It's been a pleasure.